We are group 3 with a chapter 12 discussion question. Our question for today is examine the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education. Discuss the main points of emphasis of the case. Why did the court readdress these points of emphasis in Brown versus the Board of Education in Brown 2? So we've highlighted a couple points of emphasis to start.
Okay, so beginning on May 17th, 1954 was when Brown versus Education was ruled on the first time, and that was overturning the reasoning and overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. So what Plessy versus Ferguson said was separate but equal. That was the ruling. However, this ruling on May 17th decided that separate but equal was not effective, and it was detrimental to minorities. And so the text says a sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of the law therefore has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some benefits that they would receive in a racially integrated environment.
And then we got the 14th Amendment talking about essentially you can't, or a state can't deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. And that's pretty much what Plessy versus Ferguson was talking about, especially with equal rights and due process when it comes to looking at what every student should receive and being equal, especially in the eyes of education. Back then it wasn't equal when it was Plessy versus Ferguson, and when that's pretty much how it got overturned with the 14th Amendment.
And then there was a ruling about day jury segregation, basically stating that at one point, if you had separate facilities that were equal, that would be okay. And then obviously that was overturned in the Brown case. But it just stated that even though they are separate, they still aren't equal. And so that kind of started that process of they first okayed day jury segregation and then realized that no, that's not going to work because facilities are not still equal. And then with that being said, so during the Brown case, they banned day jury segregation. And then basically they were wanting schools to remove those things that allowed segregation to happen.
So within that Brown 1 ruling, the Supreme Court said that schools needed to act with deliberate speed and good faith to convert from that dual system to a unitary school system where there wasn't that segregation. So they were assuming that after that ruling, schools would, act on that immediately. However, there was a case where one particular school had a plan to desegregate by 1 grade per year. And that was when the Supreme Court decided that that wasn't acting with that deliberate speed and good faith.
So from there, they passed Brown 2. The Supreme Court ruled in Brown 2, which said that immediate desegregation needed to happen because the local school districts were not moving quickly enough. And so they ruled to have districts immediately like unified or unsegregated.
And then just to add on to this real quick, with looking at Brown versus Board of Education, you also got to think of Jim Crow laws. And I know that's more known for the South, but Jim Crow laws was pretty much barring any African American from joining, like get on buses or other public facilities that are just white. So it's not just school. So we got to look at everything around, especially public transportation. But just real quick, on putting this as a discussion group, you guys still see some kind of segregation going on in schools nowadays? Maybe just like bordering off where districts are or open enrollment or anything like that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of types of segregation that we're seeing now because of geographical locations of schools tied to specific neighborhoods, especially in more wealthy school districts. So we're seeing not only racial segregation, but also socioeconomic segregation. And that's evident in the facilities and the recruitment of teachers and just the resources that those schools have because of the higher tax base that they're able to use.
Yeah, I like that point, Brandy. So in Lexington Public Schools, we weren't doing well for quite a while. And so we went to grade level campuses. So each building has certain grade levels just to help diminish that, I guess, socioeconomic burden that some of the schools had. And it did help. But we have one school that's dual language, so kids can opt into that school. However, it's still part of the district as an overall school. So we do see that kind of, I don't know if you would call it white flight. I think at one point it was white flight, like a lot of those children were going there versus the grade level campus schools, but now it's starting to even out. But definitely we see that. So for example, the grade level campus schools are still all Title I, but the dual language school is not.
We see a lot of white flight in Schuyler. We have 2 rural schools, and if you look at the ratio of white to Hispanic kids at those schools, or just minority students in general, the ratio is much higher at the rural schools than it is in town.
Austin, I know that you and I have just talked about teaching on reservations. And I think just kind of reflecting as listening to you guys, with it being, Walt Hill was 99% Native American. I don't know for sure what it is at Omaha Nation. But with such a high population of students who are Native, I mean, the things that I heard, I know we talked about funding and stuff, and I don't know that that's super relevant here, but I'm just going back to that point up there under the initial ruling, the detrimental effect on minorities as it was a sign of inferiority. And those are things that I heard. I taught high school and I heard my students talking about that, and just it being a Native school and the impact that had. We talk about diversity, and they had their own diversity, but at that point they were the majority. And so that was everything that they were used to. And so really at that point, it is kind of a lack of diversity too.
Yeah, I can definitely see that as being at Macy. There's no real different culture. It's all Native. So, I mean, I know a lot of my kids go to other cities, especially Omaha, Sioux City, and they kind of get that culture put into them as well, like hanging out with maybe African American, Hispanic, white, but they don't get that as much at school unless it's from the teaching staff, which is predominantly white. So they don't get a lot of that diverseness while at school.
I mean, I agree. Even in Schuyler, we really are not diverse because we're 90% Hispanic. And so, I mean, within that they're from different countries occasionally, but I mean, for the most part, they do. Our students also have kind of a culture shock when they go to college or something like that. Because they're not.
Brandy, do you guys ever have do your high school students verbalize, do they recognize that? I don't know. Like I was saying, our Native students, they would recognize and think that the white schools were superior that were in the surrounding rural communities, and that they were at a disadvantage because they went to school in the town they grew up in because there wasn't that diversity. I'm not sure if that question makes sense or not, but.
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with race. For a while, we had terrible racist comments, at every single sporting event we would go to, cross country runners would run by and, yell, build the wall and stupid crap like that. But then really, unfortunately, when we were labeled a priority school, honestly, our kids felt like it's because we're brown, it's because we, maybe don't English isn't our first language. It's because they don't understand us. Like being labeled as that was, I mean, it's still something we're overcoming, that our kids are like, we're just Skylar, you know, we're dumb. So
Interestingly enough, when you said that, so that was the 2019 when the TSI, CSI, ATSI schools came out. Austin, I think Omaha Nation was on the list also, so was Walt Hill. So all
So-
three of ours, I think, would have came out in that same year. But we
We were-
didn't hear it. I don't know that our students would have known. And to be honest, I don't know if community members knew either.
So Schuyler, the high school, is labeled a priority school, which is different than that, which is different than
Okay.
TSI and ASI, where we have national consultants that come in
Okay,
once or twice a month. And so us and Santee are the only
Okay.
two priority high schools right now in Nebraska.
oh, okay.
Mhm.
And then
so-
on top of it, you still have the CSI, right?
Yeah, and that's at the elementary level though, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep. So I think just those, while the intention is good, you know, to help, unfortunately, that underlying connotation, that underlying message that it has sent to our community members. I mean, the board meetings the last 2 years have been about like progress on the priority plan and like just equating it with negativity. And so that's just really unfortunate.
yeah. I can imagine the impact that would have on kids.
Mhm.
I know one thing that we haven't gotten to do it with Skylar yet, but eventually, like, to be able to disaggregate the data, and for you guys, disaggregating is not going to take a whole lot, but then, you know, looking at, you know, counterparts to it. So like the
Yeah.
percentage of students who are proficient, that aren't a part of a minority, and then the percent that are. There's a lot of schools in Nebraska where it's really alarming sometimes. Do we want to touch on like OPS or like LPS even, and just kind of communities and what that looks like when students are enrolling?
Well, I know at North Star when I was coming up, it opened up when I was a 7th and 8th grader. I was actually a middle school in the high school when it opened up. And if you don't know, North Star's north side of Lincoln, so we took a lot of kids from Lincoln High, and you definitely saw a lot of the Caucasian kids jump from Lincoln High over to North Star because they thought it was gonna be safer, newer, and all that stuff, and everybody else stayed at Lincoln High. So you had a huge diverse like separation from where you would kind of see a bigger like diversity pool at Lincoln High. It kind of separated when you went to North Star.
I think that's interesting because so I went to Southwest when it opened in Lincoln. So it was like the opposite, I feel like, of what you saw, Austin, just like, so I grew up in Lincoln and then I went to very diverse elementary schools, but then going to like Southwest the first couple years, there just wasn't that diversity. So even for me, like that was kind of a culture shock because I grew up where I just grew up around diversity. So it's all I ever knew until I didn't know it, I guess. So that was very interesting for me as well.
I think we've touched on most of these major points. The only thing I was going to kind of come back to is this separate but equal. I think we've all kind of recognized that while schools are not supposed to be segregated, it still happens, unfortunately, in some ways. If we go to that separate but equal piece, do you feel like those schools that have a large like minority majority population of students, do you feel like they're equal to other schools in the area?
So I will say our superintendent is amazing and he is constantly upgrading and doing what he can because he believes in our students and he believes that our students deserve a place to be proud of. And so like facility wise, like absolutely. I think also the things that we're doing like curriculum, resources, those kinds of things, we are also kind of on the like just doing everything we can to help kids. So I would say for art, like from my standpoint, no. Like in Schuyler, I think we are definitely maybe even better than, I mean, we're 1,000 times better than Takema, the all-white school that I came from, because their facilities were crumbling and, you know.
And I think looking at it from like, I like how you talked about your superintendent, like looking at it from that admin perspective and being able to come in and just like, obviously recognizing diversity, I think is important, but also just like the bar will always be where the bar is, regardless of who's here. And I think I've always worked in diverse schools since I started teaching. And so that's helped me kind of be oblivious. Like I have no idea what it would be like working in an all-white school. I never have. So I think it's just having that mentality a little bit is helpful too. Just this is the norm. Like this is what we do, and doesn't matter who you are.
I think it's really cool that this group, I don't know, we have a lot of experience in diverse schools, which is
Yeah, we
neat.
do.
I was thinking about that when we were all talking. I was like, oh yeah.
The one thing that I don't know how to say this in the best way possible. I don't know if you guys have read The Opportunity Myth from TNTP. If you haven't, you should put it on your reading list. It's really brief, but I think based on your guys' experience, you'd be really interested. And this was just something that I saw, and I think I've seen in other places, but it's this idea that the expectations are not as high when we have students of color, students with disabilities, that teachers not necessarily like consciously do it, but they have an unconscious bias to lower standards, expectations, and that students of color or from, you know, diverse experiences or students with disabilities, that they don't have access to the same like grade level rigorous materials and instruction, and the impact that that has on students and the gap that it actually widens it's just a really interesting study to look into.
Yeah. I was actually gonna say, it's more the public opinion that makes
Yeah.
segregation really happen now, especially nowadays, because you have such equal funding and the government tries to do such equal funding for every school. But a lot of it is perception. Just looking at some of the schools I've been at, it's just, they might not be looked at as positively as the other schools, and you can tell some of the kids aren't as proud about their school than others, mainly because of how everybody else looks at it.
Yeah, I think that unconscious bias plays a huge impact. I don't think it's necessarily facilities or like intentional segregation, but I still think there are maybe some inequitable opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Just yeah, giving kids excuses or reasons why they aren't reading on grade level or performing like their peers across the state, and then just really eliminating those barriers. And that's what we've worked really hard as a priority school to do the last 4 years, you know, just get to the why and then get to work.
Definitely. Any final like points or thoughts we want to add? All right, thank you guys.